All right, open up to the book of Exodus, chapter 1. On your seats is a new booklet drop. We have our new Exodus booklets for the next 5 weeks that we'll be making our way as a church through the book of Exodus. Now, we're not only going to be teaching through Exodus over the next 5 Sundays, but what we're going to be doing is in our community groups, we're going to be talking about what we are reading. So as a church, we are reading through the entire book of Exodus over 5 weeks. We have a reading plan in that booklet there available for you. And so I would encourage you, start right away tomorrow in your community groups this week. You're going to be talking about things that are coming up in your reading. I'm delighted to be kicking off Exodus today. Now, before we get into Exodus, I want to zoom back just a little bit. We are in a kind of a broader series over the next few months, understanding through the lens of the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, what it means to be a people of God's presence. The deepest longing of humanity is God himself. So what we're doing as a church, we're endeavoring to trace the story of God's presence with his people so that each one of us can fully realize our place and in his story and fully live out the realities of being a people of his presence in a world that longs to know him. And where we've been is Genesis, longing for presence. We looked at the origin of everything, God, humanity, the world, and the intent that God had from the very beginning to dwell with his people. We saw where it all went wrong and how God has continued to be faithful to a people who seem intent on rejecting his presence. So if Genesis, longing for presence, is where we started, we now open Exodus, called into presence. Exodus continues the story of God calling his people into his proximity and presence. And Exodus is this dramatic, demanding narrative and invitation. He draws near and calls his people to be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. And from the burning bush to the cloud of glory, Exodus reveals a God who initiates, who hears, who redeems, who remembers, and who dwells with his people. He rescues through the Red Sea. He defines their identity at Sinai, and in grace gives them the tabernacle, this kind of portable Eden where his presence resides. And Exodus, as we're going to find out over the next couple of weeks, starts to demand some questions of us that we still wrestle with today. Questions like, does God hear us? Does he see us? Will he act? And will we embrace his presence or fall into the same pitfalls as the Israelites and settle for lesser things? Will we trust him enough to follow wherever he leads? Or like we sang just a few minutes ago, will we take him at his word? Now, as we step into the story of Exodus, we also step into this invitation to be a people of God's presence. And so you open up to Exodus chapter 1. We're actually going to start just one page to the left, and we're going to figure out where we left off in the book of Genesis and how that connects to the beginning of Exodus. So we're going to begin by picking up where we left off last week in Genesis 50, verse 20. This is Joseph talking to his brothers, and if you remember the narrative of Joseph, they are terrified that Joseph is going to kill them in retribution for them selling him into slavery, etc., etc. So they're terrified, and they're before him, and this is what Joseph has to say. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the 3rd generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And Exodus 1:1 starts, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Pause there. So this is the narrative that we are in right now. And these two verses 7 and 8 that we just read, are doing a lot of heavy lifting for telling the story of what is happening in Egypt right now. Look again at verse 7. "The people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." Now, what do we see going on here? Look at that language: fruitful, increase, multiplied. That language sound familiar? They're doing Genesis 1. They're doing what God had set humanity out to do. They're filling the earth. And the best estimates that we have is that the people of Israel grew from roughly a family of 70, as the text tells us, to somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million people over the course of 400 years. And this line, "the land was filled with them," is a really interesting phrase. It's not just speaking of objective growth, but this subjective feeling that they're taking up more room. So at the end of Genesis, we see Pharaoh gives Joseph and his family a nice cushy plot of land to do their thing, and we fast forward 400 years, and suddenly the feeling is there's a lot of Israelites here. They're taking up more of the land. And this is how the Egyptians respond in verse 8. "Now there arose a new king over Egypt." Now, roughly right here, that now is about like 400 years later. So from Joseph to that word now in verse 8 is roughly 400 years. A new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That word "did not know" is a loaded phrase. It means this new king in Egypt did not know what was going on with Joseph, how he, with God's help, nearly single-handedly saved Egyptian from being demolished, from famine. Right? And the shared history they have, this favor that Joseph had had. Verse 9, "And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.'" So this is out of fear. At this point, the best we can tell from the narrative, the Israelites are not slaves yet. They're just a minority people group taking up a lot of land, and there's fear rising. What if they join with our enemies and overtake us? What if they join with our enemies and leave? They're too powerful, there's too many, they're too mighty for us. Verse 11, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they worked ruthlessly. They made them work as slaves." So this new king comes up, he deals harshly with them, makes them slaves, treats them poorly because they are afraid of them. At the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph is number 2 in the kingdom. His family is living in unbelievable blessing and favor in Egypt. And this new king comes up who has no regard or respect for the shared history and is fearful of this group and starts to make their life unbearable. The people are growing and multiplying and outstaying their welcome, and enough time has passed where Joseph's favor and story had been forgotten. Now, just for a frame of reference, it's 400 years. So we are in 2025. 400 years ago, there was a little boat called the Mayflower coming from England with a group of pilgrims to this new colony, Plymouth Rock. 400 years. That's a lot of time for not only the people to grow and multiply, but it's a lot of time for stories to be forgotten. And that's what happened with the people of God. And from here on out in the scriptures, Egypt, along with Babylon, a little bit later in the story, becomes this archetype and prototype for resistance to God's kingdom, resistance to his ways. They become the evil empire. They're always at odds with what God is doing with his people. So if we continue in Exodus chapter 1, there's this epic rebellion of the Hebrew midwives, which is just a fun story, midwives rebelling against Pharaoh, and God blesses them. And in Exodus chapter 2, as we turn the page, we see the origin story of Moses, who tends to be the primary character throughout the book of Exodus. Moses is born, and when his mom can't hide him anymore because of the edict of Pharaoh, who's trying to kill off all the boys, this epic moment of trust in God, she puts him in a basket and sends him up the river. And in this beautiful story of God's providence and protection, Pharaoh's daughter finds this baby. She thinks he's pretty cute, so she takes him as her own. And one of her women that's attending to her is like, hey, can I go get you a wet nurse? Can I go get you some help to deal with this baby? And she says, sure, go for it. And she gets Moses' mom and pays her to do it. It's an incredible story. It really is. It's beautiful. And what happens is Moses gets raised amongst Egyptian nobility. He's in the royal house. But as he grows, something is triggered within him when he sees one of his own people getting treated poorly. So fast forward to verse 11 of chapter 2. One day, now pause, that one day is 40 years. So this narrative we're moving along pretty quick. In the span of 3 pages, we're covering hundreds of years. So one day, 40 years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And at 40 years old, being raised in Pharaoh's household, amongst privilege, nobility, something in him turns and he notices the oppression of his people, intervenes, arguably rashly, kills a dude, and then not only his people find out about it, Pharaoh finds out about it, and he's on the run. And he heads out to Midian to start a new life in the desert. And where we are left here in this moment, as Moses is in the desert, he's hiding, he's on the run, he's a fugitive. God's people are still in slavery, still being oppressed, still being treated poorly, and Moses is in obscurity. And we get to this point right around verse 22, and we're like, what's going on? What's happening here? Aren't these God's people? Isn't he going to do something about this? And we get in Exodus 2:23 this cry for God's presence, this calling out to God to come and do something. Verse 23, during those many days, right? This is a big block of time here. During those many days, 80 years of oppression, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and the cry out for help, their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. They're crying out. And sooner or later, I think every believer finds a point in their life where they are at the end of their own rope, and they cry out to God. When that's really the only option, is to cry out to God. The only thing left to do is to cry out for God. I remember, this is a while ago, about 11 years ago, Sherry was pregnant with our first, Calvin, who was up here hiding in the back, as he was saying, Psalm 23. And she was pregnant with Calvin, and we went in for that kind of 20-week anatomy scan. They do the big ultrasound and all of that stuff, and they're doing their thing, and you hear the sound you never want an ultrasound tech to make, which is, huh. That's never a good sound if you're going into the ultrasound room, all right? It's like mystery is not fun at that point. And it's, and of course she can't really tell us much, and so we go away kind of worried, and we get a call from the doctor that there's something on Calvin's heart. There's some kind of buildup of calcium or something like that. And the doctor in that moment is not the most helpful. He's like, hey, don't freak out, this could resolve itself. He just said, hey, there's this thing, we're going to keep watching it. And of course, Sherry comes home sobbing after talking with the doctor, and we're kind of panicking and in anxiety. We've never had kids before. We don't know what's normal, what's not normal. We don't know what to do, and there's obviously nothing we can do about it. There's nothing that we can change in our life. There's nothing I can't get in there and fix the baby. There's nothing that we can do except turn to God and to cry out. Now, fast forward, just so you're not in mystery, he's fine. He was born, everything went great, it was beautiful. But whether that was like a speck on the screen or whether that was a real thing that was going on and God healed him or his body resolved it, we don't know what's going on. But in that moment, there was nothing we could do except call out to God, beg for his help, ask for him to intervene. And I'm confident he heard our prayers. When David was surrounded by enemies, he would pray things like this in the Psalms. In Psalm 5, give ear to my words. O Lord, consider my groaning. It's that same word, groaning. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God, for to you do I pray. Or in Psalm 130, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. We can picture even just the emotional state of David in those moments. Out of the depths I cry to you. The same kind of a prayer was offered up in the time of Jeremiah, when God's people were starving in the streets of Jerusalem. In Lamentations chapter 2, their heart cried out to the Lord. Let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. This is visceral language calling God to do something about this. The question, does God even hear me, is a profound one. And maybe you have felt that way. Maybe you currently feel that way. In your prayers, in your day-to-day life, you're wondering, does God even hear me? Wondering if God sees you, if he knows you, if he's hearing your prayers, or even if he cares. It's been a powerful thing to be in the prayer room over the last week and a half or so. And already to see the flood of answered prayers, it's beautiful to see the flood of worship that's up on the wall and people kind of crying out like God's holy, it's good, it's amazing. But then if you've been in there, you know there's a section by the door that's just prayer requests. People writing what they're asking God to do, what they're contending for. And I don't know if you've taken any time to read some of those, but it's a lot of crying out to God. Please save my brother who does not know you. Would you save my sister's baby who is sick right now in the hospital? I've read some prayers. God, I don't even know if you can hear me, but I'm writing this anyway. Crying out to God to intervene. The Israelites felt the same way under this Egyptian oppression. They begin to be treated poorly, mistreated, worked hard, lives made bitter, and for 80 years, they're slaves, crying out to God, are you going to do something about this? And the constant refrain throughout Scripture, the answer to these prayers is God heard my prayers. Pay attention to the language and how God responds. Verse 24, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God heard, God remembered, God saw, and God knew. Those are important words for us. It says God heard. When God hears, he hears the cries of the oppressed. God hears his people when they are in distress. When we feel like nobody cares, nobody is listening, God cares. God is listening. He hears our cries, our groanings. The Psalms tell us his ear is attuned to us. In Psalm 56, you have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Our tears matter so much to God, he doesn't lose any of them. Paul even reminds us in Romans chapter 8 that when we don't know what to pray, the Spirit prays on our behalf. When all we have is groanings like the rest of creation, the Spirit intercedes on our behalf. God always hears his people. And that word in verse 24, God hears, is this word Shema, which is a really interesting one in Hebrew. Because in Hebrew, there is no difference between hearing and acting. This word means to hear and act. To say that God heard their complaint means that God responded to it. Old Testament scholar John Saulheimer says this, quote, God's hearing is never passive. His remembrance is never nostalgic. It is always an active turning towards redemption. So God hears and is committed to act. And he remembers. God remembers his promise to his people. Now, quick theology question. Did God forget what was going on? That was suspiciously silent, you guys. Did God forget what was going on? No. Okay. Theology 101. God is omniscient. He knows everything. So this is not saying God saying, oh, I forgot. Whoops, I should really go take care of these people who are in Egypt. This is covenant language is what this is. God remembers. This is covenant language. He's saying, I remembered the promise I made to Abraham. If you flip in your Bibles or look on the screen back to Genesis chapter 15, this is what God said to Abram. He said, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. God's saying, I remember what I told Abram. I will act on my promise. God never forgets his promises. But do you notice the timeline here? 80 years of slavery. 400 years in a nation that's not their own. In the gap between God's promise and his solution, we often find prayers like, how long, O Lord? Psalm 13 begins, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? These are brutally honest prayers throughout the pages of Scripture that live in the gap between his promise and his solution. How long, O Lord? But remember Genesis 50, verse 20. God is always on about working his good plan in his time. Joseph had somewhere between 10 and 13 years of being in and out of some version of slavery or prison before he was elevated to the position that he had. God is always working his plan in his good time. He remembers the promises he's made. And God sees. God sees what's happening with his people. God is not aloof. And this is so comforting for those of us who sometimes in life feel unseen, unrecognized, undervalued. We know that is not the case with God. Psalm 34 reminds us that the eyes of the Lord, he sees, the eyes of the Lord are towards the righteous and his ears towards their cry. So God sees, and that final bit in verse 25 is God knew, God knows. And this is intimate and personal. And there's this beautiful interplay. We see this in Psalm chapter 8 between God's bigness, his cosmic bigness, and his personal and intimate attentiveness to you. God knows. Psalm 139 begins, you have searched me, and you know me. Even in the structure of these three little verses, there's a beautiful call and response thing that's happening. The Israelites, it says, cried out. They groaned 4 times. They're making their plea to God. On the Israelite side, they groaned. They cried out. On God's side, he heard and committed to act. Shema. He remembered his covenant and is going to act. He looked upon personally and intimately and is going to act. and he knew. He knows what is going on, and he is going to do something about it. This couple of verses right here are meant to stand in stark contrast to the gods of Egypt, the many gods that the Egyptians worshipped. God is not distant. He's not unpredictable. He's not wily. God is faithful and steadfast and involved, and he is present. So in the Psalms, to those prayers of how long, O Lord, to the crying out, do you see me, do you hear me, we also find these answers, like in Psalm 77. I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. Or in Psalm 34, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. He does not just hear or see or remember or knows. He's the God who acts. The God who hears is the God who saves. But God's response is not just compassion, it is action. It's not just, oh, I'm sorry for you, but it is, I will do something about this. And he's already prepared an answer in the life of Moses. At the beginning of chapter 2, God is on about preserving and protecting Moses for a specific purpose. And so we flip the page again to Exodus chapter 3, verse 1, and we see Moses keeping the flock of his father-in-law. He's out in the desert. He's got some sheep. He's got a family. He's got a father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, which is an interesting little wordplay, when the Lord saw that Moses saw, God called out to him in the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Now, pause just for a moment. Put yourself in Moses' shoes. He's 80 years old. He's in the desert. He's got some sheep. He's got a family, but he's living in relative obscurity. Moses was not expecting an encounter with God. By all accounts, it seemed like he was there to finish his life. In the quiet, in the silence, in the distance. At this point, Moses was 80 years old. Imagine how he's feeling, maybe like a traitor to his people, a failure, disconnected from his people, disconnected from God, forgotten. At 80, maybe he's even feeling like his life is winding down. I mean, 80 years old is pretty old. It's a long life, a lot of life lived, and maybe he's thinking, this is the end. I'm not really expecting God to do much more with me. But God interrupts his ordinary, obscure life to call him into something greater. And this personal call in verse 4, mirroring how God calls Abram personally in the book of Genesis. We see Moses, even though he wasn't seeking God, God was seeking him. Sometimes God interrupts us in the most ordinary, unexpected, unassuming places. Then God said in verse 5, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now this phrase, holy ground, God says, take off your sandals, this is holy ground. This phrase is a really interesting one. It's the first time holy is attached to a place. And what is important to understand about this line is this is not about geography, it's about presence. This is not a super special plot of land, and there's still a memorial there to this day. This is because God's presence was there. It was set apart, it was unique, it was different, because God himself was residing in that place. Now here's what's also curious about those lines. Where in Near East culture in Moses' time and place would one take off their shoes? In a house. After dust, dirty, you're working all day, you're trudging around in the sand, you're dealing with sheep. You don't want to bring that inside your house. You're going to mess up the carpet, Like you're not going to do, it's going to smell, it's going to stink. But it's also this like posture of comfort. Some of you guys are weird about feet, and I get it. And you walk into someone's house and they say, oh, we've got carpet, please take off your shoes, and you have a panic attack right away. It's a feeling of hospitality and comfort. And this is God saying to Moses, this ground right here is special because I'm here. I'm taking up residence here. My presence is here, and I'm inviting you to be close to me. Come make yourself at home with me. It's a beautiful picture of divine hospitality. Moses, this wanderer, this fugitive, is invited into God's presence, his abode. And God says, he is the God who is present. I'm the God who is here with you. Continue on in the story in verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up to the land, to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Sound like bugs, but they're people group. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me. He says it again, I've heard them, and I've seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. This is important, verse 10. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So God is saying, I have seen what's going on. I'm preparing to do something about it. And God says, Moses, you're my man. I'm sending you. You're going to join me in my work. I'm sending you. You are going to be as to Pharaoh as like me. You're going to do this. In verse 11, Moses says to God, thanks but no thanks. He says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children out of Egypt? He must be thinking of his obscurity, his history, his betrayal, all the ways he has messed it up. And look at how God responds. He says, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Yahweh responds to Moses and says, I will be with you. And at which point, Moses asked, okay, so I'm going to go tell all these people that you have sent me. They're going to ask me which God, because there's a lot of gods going on in Egypt. Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? What do I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am, which really clears things up for us. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God's name here, as revealed to Moses, I am, is not just a title or even an identifier. It's a statement of his presence with his people. I am is not a distant force or a silent observer or a God to be appeased. He is a God who is, who was, who will be present with his people. In her kind of summary of this story, Carmen Imes, Old Testament scholar, says, from the beginning, God's goal is not simply to rescue, but it's to dwell with his people. In his name is a commitment to be with his people. Moses says, who am I? I'm not going to do this. I'm nobody. I'm out here in the desert. I'm really good at sheep. I've been doing sheep for 40 years. That's what I'm best at. Why are you going to send me? And God's answer is, I am will be with you. God doesn't answer Moses, his insecurities with reassurance about Moses. Oh, Moses, no, you've got this, bro. You can do it. Go, your staff is going to do really cool things. Like, trust me, this is going to be great. You're so tall and handsome. Like, you can do this, Moses. You got this. Wash up, get the sheep off you and go to Pharaoh. He's going to listen. This is not what God is doing in this moment. God is not saying, Moses, you've got this. He's saying, Moses, I will be with you, and that's enough. Moses' calling is not about his skill or ability. It is about God's presence with him. This has nothing to do with Moses' ability, his skills. This is about God sending his presence and his name forward with Moses. That's the difference maker. This is what qualifies Moses, God's presence. And the entire Exodus journey, from the outset, hinges on this truth. Even though Moses is kind of the main character of this book, Exodus is not really about Moses. It's about the presence of I am with his people. That's what Exodus is about. It's not just about rescuing from slavery. It's not just about plagues. It's not just about 10 commandments. It is about God with his people. Now, we have a unique position in history to look back on this story. Thousands of years removed, we are also on this side of Jesus' work on the cross and the resurrection. So as we go back and look at these Old Testament narratives, we look back just a little differently than they would have at that time. Because we know Jesus ultimately comes as the fulfillment of everything promised in the Bible. It's Jesus himself who picks up on this language in John chapter 8 when he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Which, if you know this story, the very next verse, they're prepared to stone him to death because those are fighting words. That's blasphemy. And Jesus himself is saying, I am. I and I am are one. All the stuff that's happening in Exodus finds its ultimate fulfillment in me. In the same way Israel was enslaved and redeemed from Egypt, we were enslaved and redeemed from sin. Earlier in John 8, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin." It's very purposeful language on Jesus' part. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you are free indeed. In the same way Moses was sent to deliver God's people, Jesus was sent as the great deliverer. Look at the language in John chapter 3, this infamous verse about God's heart towards humanity. For God so loved the world, or loved the world in this way, that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his son, send is deliverance language. God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. And in the same way God invites Moses into his presence, Jesus moves into our neighborhood. And this language in John chapter 1 is fascinating. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That word dwelt is the same word for tabernacle. It's the same word for abide, abode. It's to make your home somewhere. The Word became flesh and made its home among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. This is where the Exodus story is headed. It's not just freedom from slavery. That's a big narrative plot point, but it is not the end-all be-all of Exodus. It's not the plagues, although that's fun to read. It's not the journey and the wandering in the desert. It's not the first run at the 10 Commandments. It's not the Sinai. It is God with his people. That is the movement of Exodus. It's God's presence with his people. And this, living in this moment in history, is what we get to fully enjoy in the way that Moses never could, in the way the Israelites never could. We get to fully enjoy full access to God's presence because of the work of Jesus and his Spirit inside of us. But this is where we're going in the story of Exodus over the next few weeks. This is not just about getting out of Egypt. It's about getting into God's presence. Michael Morales, an Old Testament commentator, theologian, he says salvation is not just from something, but to someone. Just so good. And the same is true for us. Our life with God is not just about avoiding things, avoiding temptation, avoiding sin, avoiding hell, avoiding worldliness, whatever we would kind of put in that category. It's not just about avoiding that stuff. It's not so important what you were saved out of, but what you were saved into. Our life with God is not just about escaping or avoiding something. It's about being brought into relationship and proximity and presence with God. Look at the language. As Jesus is ending his time on earth and his final commissioning to his disciples, this is what Jesus says to his disciples in Matthew 28:20. I am with you always to the end of the age. This is the culmination, the climax of his great commission. Go make disciples, teach, baptize, all of that. I am with you always. This is the picture we have at the very end of Revelation, the very end of this story that we have. John, in his heavenly vision, this is what he sees in verse 3. It says, it's a new heaven, a new earth, all this stuff, the holy city. And I heard a voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. The tabernacling place with God is with man. God is making his home with humanity. He will dwell, abide, tabernacle with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. You can find this or some version of this line in almost every book of the Bible. It's everywhere. This is the great call of God reconciling all things to himself. That he will be our God and we will be his people and he will dwell with us. I've had loads of conversations with people over the years who seem to know a lot about God, but have never really known God. I encounter a lot of, I believe in a God, but I don't know God. A lot of people who've attended church for years and have never encountered the risen Christ. I think the question we have to wrestle with from Exodus is not, is God with us? Because whether we feel it or not, he is always with us. That is his promise to us. I think the question we have to wrestle with is, do we want it? Do we want him? Do we desire him? The unfolding pages of Scripture speak of a God who is always pursuing us, who is with us, who is present with us. And in this weird, mysterious partnership I don't really have a theological framework for, we seem to determine how much of God we experience. Now, God is gracious and he will break through in certain moments, but our readiness, our willingness often plays a role. I don't understand it. I don't know why God doesn't just trump my desires and give me all of himself, but we have prayers like from Paul saying, give us your fullness, because we don't have it yet. There's still more to grow into. So we open the story of Exodus. I think it's a moment to analyze some of our desires, because the invitations are clear. There's a twofold invitation in this story. Come with me and come join me. This invitation to presence and this invitation to mission. That is all over the pages. It's here. That is the invitation. Jesus is the way back into presence. He has unlocked what was locked before. He has brought into fullness what was only a shadow before. He has given us full access to the Father. So the question is, what will you do with that? God is offering himself to you. Enjoy me. Be with me. Be shaped by me. Be formed by me. Join me in my work. Join me in my mission. What will you do with that? Because despite all my neat theological boxes, God seems to care about that question. God seems to come where he's wanted. I'm done. But I feel like I maybe just opened up a can of worms. So we're going to respond together, and maybe I'm going to lead us through some response. So the team, you guys can come up, and I'll walk you through how we respond in just a moment. But I do want to make clear, if you are hungering for more of God's presence today is a great time to do that, to deal with that. If you maybe fall in that category of someone who's maybe known a lot about God, but doesn't actually know God, consider this your invitation to know him. Because he wants to be known. He wants to be known by you. He wants to be fully enjoyed. He wants to satisfy you. The invitation is here. And we have some people who'd love to pray with you. We have some moments of response as we sing together. There's going to be songs that we're singing that are going to maybe even proclaim something that you don't even feel like is true of you yet. And that's okay. There's a lot of gray area in the zone of worship. We're going to receive from the table, celebrating and participating the work of Christ that busted open the doors of this pursuing God for you and for me. We're going to give as a generous response to God's unending generosity towards us. But I do want to encourage you. I'm going to pray for you in just a moment. If there is something in you that's just like grinding your gears, if you're like, what is it about this that stuck out? What is it about this that's pinging me today? I would encourage you, don't just like do the polite hands in your pockets kind of humming along. Like take a step towards enjoying him, pursuing the God that's pursuing you, praying with somebody. You come up here. We have people who'd love to pray for you. You could tap someone on the shoulder next to you and say, I feel like God is drawing me into something. So go ahead and stand, pray for our time. Lord, as we step into these tender moments for some that maybe feel like something real is happening, where maybe you are drawing us closer to yourself, maybe for the first time we are hearing or sensing you, maybe we just want more of you. We've tasted and seen your goodness and we just want more. Holy Spirit, I ask that you would do what only you can today. That as we lift up Jesus, you would make yourself known. You would reveal yourself to us. Amen.